Thank you. Yes, so the first time I tried this was a couple weeks ago, and it was sort of hard to believe that after 7 years of giving talks about web typography, this was the first time I tried it in a browser. And so naturally, I thought that the obvious thing to do is take that 15-minute little self-running thing and turn it into an hour-long talk at the biggest web conference I've ever been to. But kudos to the Firefox team for having the best running animations in this. So you're the kind of crowd that needs to know this up front. The first time I did it, I didn't tell them until the end of it. And it was great. It was a nice little reveal at a design event. But you know what this means. This is live stuff in a browser. Everything is running just as it would run in your own projects. And everything here are real fonts that people can go buy or use from like open source sources. So this is something that's really dear to my heart. I've been working with variable fonts since their inception. They're first introduced 2 years ago. 1 year ago, there were 0 shipping browsers that supported it, and today, all shipping browsers support it, with one exception, the UC browser. So we've heard all about that. We know that this could be potentially a really big deal. It depends on where your audience is, but Firefox, Safari, Chrome, Edge, the main browsers on Android and everything on iOS, they all support variable fonts. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what they are. First, I'll just basically distract you with my pals, Tilly and Tristan. So while I have them up on stage, they'll be back in a little bit. The thing that I wanted to stress before I get sort of into the groove here and forget to bring it up is how I got here, and on whose shoulders I've been able to do many of these things, because a lot of those people are in the room, and I get to say thank you. So I'm on stage, and I'm going to do it. Everything about grid, everything about modern ideas and layout, a lot of the inspiration that I take to bring graphic design to the web comes from people like Jen Simmons and Rachel Andrews. So I thank you very much. Pretty much everything that I know about animation on the web comes from people like Val Head and Rachel Neighbors, who unfortunately is not here, but Val is, so thank you very much. And pretty much everything that I know about how to behave when I'm here, when I'm sitting with all of you at lunch and we're getting drinks or going for our little like running/walking outings in the morning, comes from seeing people like Dan Mall at conferences. From the very first one that I went to, he was incredibly generous with his time, really open with everything. That's the way every speaker I've ever met at one of these web conferences behaves. And that's what is required of us when we come here by Jeffrey and Eric. So thank you all as well for fostering that kind of inclusive environment, and it's great to meet all of you. So, moving on. That was a little self-indulgent, I'm sorry. But I think it's important to take those moments and remind ourselves of the community that we're in. Now, John Tan threw back a few decades in the history of design, so naturally I figured I had to outdo that and go back even further. And the reason I have this up on the screen, this book of Psalms from about the mid-1500s, is that it's about the purpose of the way this is visually presented. So when we talk about words and using words, the interface of those words between the source and the recipient is type. And so that type is that voice of what we're being presented with. And the importance of this is conveyed in the manner in which it was created. You look at that, you see the richness of the illustration, the care which went into creating this, and you know that it is something of significance in your hands. So the weight of that message is brought across in the physicality of the thing. And coming forward, we can see that there's care being taken in all of these marks, and from a monotype matrix from I think the early part of the 20th century, where this encoding of beauty and aesthetics and proportion and meaning in the form of the letters. And then in the structure of the typography itself, in books like Elements of Typographic Style, we've had these rules codified for us about how do we put that meaning and voice and tone and present things in a meaningful and understandable way. And that's something that's really important about that interface between the people who are writing something and you, the person who is receiving it. Now, back in the early 30s, Beatrice Ward, who's an incredibly gifted and talented writer and critic and creative director, wrote this essay called The Crystal Goblet. And this essay was all about the notion that there could be this perfect form of typography for a given piece of content that would shape the content without coloring it. So that's the notion of crystal. It's about presenting it in a well-formed way without influencing your perception of the meaning of what's being put across. But I don't agree with that. I think good typography is obviously important, but type is never neutral. Even if you make the most intentional decision to not put some meaning in it, even that decision in and of itself conveys something. So I mean this, I really do. You're all really wonderful people. Some of you I know better than others, but I'm not really saying it with that. I mean, you would expect from somebody like me to have it maybe more like this, because that's what type-obsessed hipsters do. But I can't really even compete again with this, the actual hand of my wife writing that note. So those kinds of things matter. The form and shape of those characters influences the way we receive that message, and it takes on more and more meaning the more we can attach to that, the more we can identify with it. And that's what brought this phrase to mind. Type is how we hear what we read. So what is that voice? How is it constructed? How is it brought forth? And what does it remind us of when we see it? So this book, in print, is really beautiful. It's designed by Bruce Kennett. It's a book about W.A. Dwiggen's work, and it incorporates lots of Dwiggen's typefaces in it. And all of those relationships about how things are typeset are really intimately tied to the designer and the time and the place. So all of those relationships and that form and structure create really beautiful printed pieces. And the wonderful thing is now, with open type features and good fonts available, we can do things in a really similar way with a similar level of polish in a web page. So that is a web page set with a son from Typekit. It's beautiful, beautiful typeface design. We want initial capitals. We want to style the first line of text. We want to use nice contrast in the size of the display typeface, get nice ligatures. All of those things supported. We can do beautiful typography on the web if we so choose. But then the content changes because it's a CMS. So all the careful typesetting that we did in that headline just went out the window because the type changed. And we haven't gotten into even the screen changing. But then, of course, engineering comes along and says, we need to add another tracking script, so pull the web fonts entirely, and this is what you're going to get. So this is the tension that we have between design changes, content changes, performance. All of those things play a part in how can we construct our typography and get that voice without creating a worse user experience by putting too much stuff in the way, too many font files to download. And we really kind of got ourselves into a corner where we have capability, but we can't responsibly deliver it if we want to give people a good experience and get the content on screen. Because those words don't matter if people can't see them. And I thought this really summed it up well from Rich Rudder, the author of Web Typography and the organizer of the Ampersand Conference, and along with John Tan, the co-founder of FontDeck, which is one of the original font services, which is a real shame that that's not still around. But the point is, we get laughed out of the room. As graphic designers, it's totally normal for us to use 10 or 15 different weights and variants of a typeface in a design. And on the web, we'll get laughed out of the room if we ask for more than 3 or 4. It just won't happen. So there is this inherent problem that we have in trying to raise the level of our design and speak more clearly and eloquently and beautifully to really get this message across while still having to deliver that experience. So we've ended up here. And we've tried to design our way out of this. And this is where I might not speak as highly of design systems as some of the people that came before, but for a very specific reason. We've tried to come around to this idea of creating a design system that will handle any and all content. And this concept might start to sound familiar. We want to create a design system that can handle any and all content that we might throw at it. Because we've had to find some way to standardize this experience and optimize around it and create something that will work in this publishing platform, in that content management system, in this static site generator. And the problem is we have the button department and we have the person who is like VP of header operations, and they're working on all of these different areas of the design system, but the typography is very often an afterthought. And this is one of the better ones. So I went to styleguides.io, I surveyed a whole bunch of the top design systems there, and I found 2 that actually deal with screen size in their typographic system. I know more of them do, but if it took me that long to find them, we've got a problem. So Shopify at least has in their Polaris system something for large and small screen. And then as you'd expect from the BBC with their gel system, they go much further, and that's great. They do a really thorough job of thinking through size and scale relationships of type and various screen size and device combinations. And that's really important to get that scale right to still convey the same hierarchy on a small screen and a large one without getting in the way of the reading experience. But I want to talk to you about average, because that's what we're doing here. We're creating a design system that handles the average of any content that we throw at it. As Jen has talked about in the past, that idea of you get the comp that has exactly the same words in the title repeated 12 times, exactly the same number of words in the body copy repeated 12 times. That's not real life. So on 99% Invisible, they had this great episode talking about average, and they were talking about average size of a pilot. In the 20s, in the US Army Air Corps, they measured all their pilots and they came up with 10 different dimensions and created average measurements, and they built all their planes around that. So the position of the seat, the shoulder straps, the throttle controls, all of these things were designed to fit that perfect average size pilot. And then after World War II, they started seeing training accident fatalities go up, and they didn't know why. So eventually, UX research saved the day. They went and they started doing a bunch of analysis on that average data and measured a whole bunch of pilots. And they found over the hundreds of pilots that they surveyed, not a single one of them fit all 10 dimensions of that average. In fact, it had to drop it down to matching only 3 to find 5% of those pilots. And the reality was, when you design something for the average pilot, you're designing it to fit nobody. That was literally true. And as soon as they started putting in adjustable seat belts, adjustable seat height and positioning, and adjustable throttle controls, fatalities went down and performance went up. So the same thing is true with our design systems. When we design to fit the average content, we're optimizing it for nothing at all. And that's the problem that I have with design systems, is we treat them as the pinnacle when they're really just the plateau. That's the necessary table stakes to create a system where we can have uniform, consistent, good design, and that should be the starting point that we take to go on to bigger and better things. That's not where we stop. And that's where these tools come in handy. It's a shortcut for us to get to the point where we can then move forward and do really interesting, new, intrinsic design. We're not going to get there without the baseline, but we can't stop there. This is what we end up with. Now, I love dogs, we all know that, but when you end up with the same content and the same design system on every single screen, on every single media website, you end up with this. It's the same across every media site. If you cut off the header, you can't tell what it is. It's all consistent. It's the same little squishy boxes. Nothing really stands out, except maybe the typography when you look at The Guardian, or if you see a headline on the New Yorker website. But other than that, it's this sea of sameness. And really what we've done is create a new crystal goblet. So we need to remember that this is the point at which we can now build and do newer and more interesting things. And that's where this came in. So the idea of variable fonts. So let's talk about what those are. They were introduced 2 years ago, and it was a pretty remarkable thing. Our support is really good. It's supported in the main desktop operating systems, the mobile ones. It's supported in the shipping browsers. You can even play around with them in Photoshop and Illustrator. But what exactly are they? As John Hudson described it, who's one of the original people writing about this format, it's a single font file that acts as many. So instead of having all of these separate font files that you have to install or reference in your project, you can actually get one that contains all of it. And that's really pretty interesting. It gives us a lot of possibilities. So when we start thinking about what we might vary, I thought I'd bring Tristan and Tilly back and talk about these axes of variation. So we can play with the width. We might play with weight. We might even play with X height. And the truth is, you can have any axis that you want as a type designer and expose that and manipulate it with CSS. It's not a distortion. It's only what that type designer will allow, and it can even include slant. So you can have italics that are on-off. You can have a slant that moves along that axis. You can, these are the ones, the sort of registered axes of width, weight, italics and slant, and then optical size, which I'll explain a little bit more in a bit. Those are the sort of standard axes that map to existing CSS, which I'll show you in a moment. But you can also have custom axes that allow you to do other things that you might define, and we'll see what some of those might look like. So with this, we're able to do a lot of really interesting things and elevate the voice that we use and start to think about ideas that, some like what Jen was talking about on Monday, about the notion of this viewport being a camera frame and contents moving in and out of it, and looking at some of the techniques that people use in design where things might move. So think about broadcast, and one of the things about title sequences where there's that sort of slow build and movement that draws your eye to pieces of content. What if we start doing things like that as we draw people into the page and bring them into the experience and have it react a little bit more? So instead of trading our vocal range for page speed, we can actually have a single asset that allows us to take advantage of all these things and bring some life and movement into the design in subtle ways that can really amplify that message. But it can also react to context. So it's going to be one way on a large screen and another one on a small. So you might do things like, so stop for a moment and just comment that most of what you've been seeing here has been Roslindale, which is a typeface by David Jonathan Ross that I got from his Font of the Month Club. You should all check this out. It's amazing. It's what I've been using on my website, so I used it in the presentation. The one in the center here is from my friend Lisa Fischbach at Typemates over in Germany. They gave me this one to play around with that also has a width axis. So on a small screen, I can make those characters just a little bit narrower and have more characters per line and a smoother reading experience. Or we can take a look at using, maybe? There we go. Amstelvár. Amstelvár was one of the original ones designed by David Berlow at Type Network to demonstrate the format, and it has all kinds of things. And what I've done here is gotten myself into a bit of a bind where you see the descender on the Y running over the top of the T. And if I really want to have a tightly set headline, but I don't like those sorts of collisions, I might want to tuck that descender up just a little bit. And now it looks a lot nicer. It's a little bit more polished, a little bit more refined, because I have two axes to play with, the height of the ascenders and the depth of the descender. And I can just bring them up a little bit. Or I can then combine the other techniques of width and hyphenation to create a smoother reading experience, again, for that smaller screen, which could also then lead me to playing with another axis. So when I create a night mode and I want that text to stand out just a little bit more, I can increase the grade. So now I've created a little bit more contrast between the foreground and the background, so people with low vision or in low ambient light situations could have an easier time reading that text. So let's see what it looks like. So under the hood, inside, the way this format works is it stores the regular outline, and then it stores the deltas, or those points. And you can see all the different outlines of the letter form, from thick to thin, wide to narrow. And all the format has to do is store those points, and then the browser can shift the outline around. It's like storing Bezier points. That's literally what it's doing. so that you can move through that whole design space across all these different ways of interpolation and drawing the character. It's really interesting stuff. Now, I'd mentioned optical sizing before, and I want to come back to that because this is actually something that was really normal for a very long time, and we lost somewhere in the 60s when we shifted to photo typesetting and other kinds of digital type. So optical sizing is about tailoring the physical characteristics of the letter form for the physical size at which it's going to be shown. And if we take a look at this broadsheet from about 1720 or so, William Caslon printed this, and the whole point was to showcase how well this type would reproduce at various physical sizes. And what I want to draw your attention to is normalized for size, we can see a 72-point capital C and then a 6-point capital C. Notice how much sturdier the strokes are in the small size. So at a physically smaller size, you don't want the letter forms to fall apart in print or on a digital screen. You want to make sure that you can represent it well. But what happened when they made digital type was they took one outline and scaled it. So this doesn't look bad. This is Amstelvár again, but it's not really taking advantage of the delicacy of that typeface in the larger size. Everything is normalized for the small size. But when we turn on optical sizing, if that's an available axis, you can get this, automatically adjusting for the size of the type. And it's getting the nice delicate scale and contrast difference of the large size, but the small text didn't change at all because that's the appropriate optical sizing there. So this is an axis that was a new attribute that was added, font optical sizing. We'll look at the syntax in a bit. Most browsers have implemented it. There's one that hasn't yet. Chrome hasn't, but we're getting there. You can still specify it using an alternate syntax that we'll look at. But the goal is to be able to just leave it on auto so that whenever your text resizes, you'll automatically get the optimal representation of those characters. So here's what it looks like. It's not so different. There's a couple of key things that you need to change. For the format, you need to specify that it's a variable font, so it's WAF2 variations. And generally speaking, if the browser supports variable fonts, you get a few other things for free along the way. You know it supports WAF2, so you can get the best possible compression. It also supports CSS variables and calculations, and we'll look at why that's kind of an interesting thing as well. But when you're adding things like font weight and font stretch or font style, instead of saying just one number, it's normal, it's bold, we actually specify the range. And this is important in order to tell the browser when you're specifying font weight where the edges of that range to clamp to. And this also gives you freedom as a designer, if it's going into a content management system, to limit the design space that people can use. So you could say, I only really want people to use font weight 300 to 800. And if you define it here, when somebody specifies something using font weight, they can't go outside that boundary. Font style is still a little bit tricky in that if you have an oblique typeface, you would specify it this way. Here's your degree range. If it's italics, currently, you should probably avoid specifying that at all. It'll still work, but you don't really, there's still a little bit of disagreement on the exact syntax of how that should work. You'll note font stretch is defined with a percentage range. So a low end and a high end, always with the percent. Even if it goes up to 1,000, you still need, if you're going to use font stretch, then you need to add that percentage sign. And I'm focusing on these things because I want to make sure that when we're looking at this, we want to use what's up top. We want to use the existing attributes rather than the one on the bottom, which is what we need to use to access the custom axes, the standard ones of width, weight, italics, optical size. Generally, we want to just stick with what's up top. You're going to specify font style italic or oblique in a number of degrees. Font optical sizing, generally you'll want to set to auto instead of none. Turning it off kind of doesn't really make much sense if it's available. That's the one of those top 5 where you'll probably end up wanting to use it in the bottom. But font variation settings is our low-level thing without the guardrails. It also means once you define one of those things, you have to redefine all of them every time you want to change it. The loophole is you can make those values a CSS variable, so you could actually just update the variable, but that's kind of getting beyond the scope of today. Here's what it might look like with a combination of other both custom and registered axes of the normal ones up top, and then grade is the one I was showing you to get the contrast. The notable thing about grade is it doesn't change the physical space in which the text sits. So you can strengthen the contrast without reflowing everything. And then ascenders and descenders, the other two from Amstelvár. I wrote a guide. Thank you, Jen, for getting me involved in working on this. It was really a lot of fun. So on the Mozilla Developer Network, there's a pretty comprehensive guide there with tons of examples to show you how to implement all of this stuff properly. And what's even better is if you get the nightly build, you get to play around with what Jen was showing earlier, and then you can actually work with the variable fonts right in the browser. So you can see down there on the lower right, I'm just selecting that bit of text, and it's exposing everything I can do with that variable font for that header, and I can play with it right there. And what you see in that drop-down menu are called named instances. This is really important. It's a great feature within that typeface to let us see what does the designer think is bold condensed, and see what the values are, and see if we want to tweak them a little bit. But this gives us a starting point to see how the type designer envisioned our using this typeface. But that's going to be coming out in the next release, I think. Awesome. So end of this month, it'll be shipping in Firefox. Every time you right-click and inspect something, you'll be able to expose this third little pane down there, look at the fonts, see all of the different attributes of it, and how you might alter them, and then see it in the browser in real time. So this is a page that I designed for Monotype for the release of FF Meta. So another typeface that's now out there for you to be able to use. And I want to mention something about why we as designers care about having this level of freedom. And it reminded me this morning, which is the useful time on my walks, so when everybody else was running and I was walking by myself, when I wasn't looking out for alligators, I was thinking about type weights, and as you do. And it reminded me of a video that Hillman Curtis showed at the first web conference I went to. It was an interview with James Victori, who, if you don't know, is a prolific and really talented graphic designer. He's done a lot of political advertising and posters and stuff, and it's really, he is, to his roots, a designer, a graphic designer, and he really loves unleashing the power of it. And he said in this interview that he doesn't care about the tools. Give him some colored paper and some scissors, and he'll kick any other designer's ass. He will create a more powerful message than you possibly could imagine, no matter what your tools are. And he's probably right. Certainly he kicked mine. Sorry about that. But I feel the same way about a really good typeface. I don't care about any other design elements. If you give me one typeface and access to all the widths and weights and variability in that, I can create a great piece of design. A strong piece of design, one that will be compelling and resilient, because I can now present that message in a way that's appropriate for the medium and the context and the user's current state in ways that's just never been possible before. So we had one axis, we had weight, and we had italics. And so I wrote this essay and designed this page, and I wanted to make sure that we could really showcase all of the ways that this might work. And so it would just kind of reflow, and I could do all that with one 84K file. And that was replacing 18 files at nearly 300K. So that's a little optimistic. A production typeface with a really complete character set is going to be a little bit more than that, but we'll see in a moment it's not that much. But I don't want to stop with just using the variable font. I want to embrace all of the things that we have at our disposal. So I started thinking about what Tim Brown wrote a few years ago, this technique called CSS locks. And if you don't know who Tim Brown is, he's the head of typography at Typekit, and also just recently published a book apart called Flexible Typesetting. And it is an absolutely gem of a read. You really should check it out. You'll really have a much deeper understanding of how you can shape and work with text in a digital platform. But the point with this was thinking about resizing across different screen sizes and getting an appropriate rhythm and flow. And he came up with this idea where, like Jen has talked about using viewport units to size text. And she'd been talking about that for a while, I think back to maybe 2014. And the problem that I had with it was I didn't want to change the body copy because I really felt that it was important to leave that at whatever the device said was a readable size. But I want to scale the headers. And I didn't know how to stop the scaling on one so it doesn't end up getting smaller than the other. And so that was a little problematic for me, but this technique actually combines viewport units along with fixed breakpoints that we can define to create a stop point. So it'll get no smaller than this, it'll get no bigger than this. And once those things started to come together in my mind with variable fonts and some of these other techniques like CSS variables that I was learning about from Leah Veru, it clicked. And so I started to put these things together, define the CSS variables for the breakpoints, define the low and the high-end size or line height or anything else that you want to vary, some caveats that I'll come back to, but plug it into this. You've had one session to wake up, so I'm not hitting you with this over the head at 9 in the morning, so there's that. But the wonderful thing about this is once you write it, you actually never have to change it. You could actually introduce this for any selector and then just update those CSS variables. So starting at the top, we have the low end. That's easy. We're mobile first, so without any breakpoint, we're sizing it for the minimum. And at the bottom, once we reach the largest breakpoint, we're sizing it for the max. Those are easy. In the middle, once we hit that lowest breakpoint, up to that largest one, we want to scale smoothly from 5 to 10. This takes the combination of that min and max, the low and the high end of the breakpoints that we've specified, and viewport units, and does a bunch of math that thankfully Tim figured out first, and it works. So the only limitation on using this technique, obviously beyond browser support, is that you need to be able to use a unit that comes at the end of it. So it has to be expressed in a viewport unit, a pixel, an M, a %, whatever the last thing is, I think. Jen and I were kind of wondering about this earlier. I'm not sure exactly what wins for the last unit it's expressed in, but this gives you M units or rem units, whichever one you want. And the problem is if you need a unitless value for a font weight, for example, that's not possible yet, but they haven't introduced an update to the specification that is coming so that you will be able to get a unitless value with calculation. And that will let us also smooth font weight or width just as smoothly. And so what I've found is by using this technique, and I've been putting this into practice on my own site and also in a design system for a large state nearby for their new platform, and it works really nicely. When you have the browser support, when you've got a good variable font, you can have your whole typographic system scale across every component smoothly and identically across any screen size. And you don't have to write any more media queries. You can just have this little block, and then all you have to do later on to resize it for some other part of the UI is redefine one of those variables, and it works beautifully. And so here's another example. Now, the previous screen was already doing it. That's a live page for Monotype's FF Meta. Avenir Next is one of the next ones that they're about to release. And this one is even more remarkable. The production-ready character set, multiple language support, hundreds and hundreds of glyphs. Instead of 600K and 32 files, it's a single file at 210K. Now, some people might object at a 200K font file, but think of all you can do with that when you start to scale all these things. And you can get all of that utility out of this one cacheable asset, all the design freedom that you get. Just drop a JPEG. One, just one. Or switch around the ordering of your JavaScript and get the savings there. Get your content on screen. Get this asset because that unlocks the possibilities of your design. But what if your axis is time? That's kind of a neat idea, right? That's a real typeface from Underwear called Bellow. And the variable version of it has axes for writing all the text at once or character by character. And I'm going to go back and show you that again because you need to see the ink spread. Watch that. So there's an axis of time and there's an axis of bleed. So it's really up to the type designer's imagination. But it doesn't have to stop with just readability or just this kind of more decorative flair, although having text come in, it's all there, it's searchable, it's accessible, but visually it has a different presentation. That's pretty remarkable that we can do all of that with a single typeface. But it's also in other languages too. So and there's other areas where this can be a really big deal. I saw this at A-Type-I last year in Montreal. So that stroke that's moving and stretching in the middle there was in this presentation from Sahar Afshar and Jose Miguel Soler. They did this beautiful example. That's a kashida, and that's a particular kind of stroke. And forgive me, I'm not really deeply versed in Arabic, but what I learned is that stroke is something that can be altered in order to suit the taste of the typographer. It can, or the calligrapher rather, or it can be used to justify text, or it can be used to pace the reading of the text. And I thought that was a really interesting thing, where it's altering our perception and meaning with this axis of variation. But they really outdid themselves. The next time I saw them talk about it was at Typo Labs in Berlin earlier this year, and they'd taken that whole idea and brought it into a web interface and made it draggable. So imagine that, being able to actually work on the text that you're setting, and all those little red boxes, that's a draggable handle. And you can just go into any one of those and just move it around and just save the CSS that's being generated. So it actually gives you real typesetting control in this text live in a browser. And you have to go look at play.typedetails.com, which is Wentin, this really incredibly talented designer and developer at Adobe. She created this website that has tools like this to see an X height that you can just click on and drag, or this sort of two-axis little graph that you can use to alter two different axes of the type at the same time. I mean, I think it's these kinds of UI ideas that we're starting to see pioneered that are just absolutely bonkers. I mean, they really go way beyond this idea of like a slider is the only thing that we can do. The slider is sometimes appropriate, but it's not the only answer. And this is where we get into these ideas where, you know, our tools, we shape our tools and our tools shape ourselves. We want to make sure that we're having this in the right proportion, that we're not stopping with the first solution, that we're actually looking for the most appropriate and understandable one. So I think those kinds of things were really incredible, and I wanted to make sure that you could see the applicability of this across all different kinds of applications. But it's not just online either. ADIDAS has been working with variable fonts for over a year, and they don't use them on the web. They use them in print. All of their printed communications, their advertising and marketing materials, and even uniform design are being done with Adenoia Pro and Adenoia Chop. And they were kind enough to give me these typefaces to work with on a web page. And again, that's a single file that produced all of that. And it gets even more fun when you start to put it in motion. And we can start to think about really interesting things that we could do as designers to create compelling layouts in motion. And again, that's one file. So all of that variability. Now this is like the Spinal Tap of variable fonts. It goes from 1 to 1,000 in width and weight. And now think about that in the context of uniform design. So they have uniform design for any school, any organization. Everybody gets to go and they can use, in the design of the uniform for even the school with the smallest budget, they get to give them the best possible level of design. So they're elevating the output that any school can get to give them a more professionally designed uniform, even if it's that smallest school that can barely afford to get the t-shirts made for their students, but they look good. So that's a real positive outcome from this typeface, and they haven't even touched the web with it yet. So I mean, there's a real power with this that we're just starting to tap, and they actually had Kenneth Ormandy create a plugin for them to use in Illustrator so they can work with variable fonts there and get fit to width text right in their design applications. So again, we're experimenting, we're finding these new ways of working with this stuff, we're finding new things we can do with them and building tools at the same time that expand our repertoire and capabilities as designers. And that is really incredible. It's really powerful. But I have to, you know, this has to come to an end sometime soon. But I had this drop in my lap last week, and I couldn't resist wanting to add this in here. And the hint is really on the screen right now. People are asking me a lot, like, where are the fonts? There aren't that many. There's probably 100 or so that you could get right now. But imagine what you can do with a really good one. That's going to replace a whole bunch of other fonts with all the different things you could do. But we want our big deal, most popular web fonts. And so I asked the designer, and he said he'd played around with it. He wasn't really sure. He didn't know what the demand for it might be. And I said, well, I've got this project. I'd love to see if we could maybe work with it on this. If you're game, just let me know. And so I asked him that again on Tuesday or Wednesday of last week. And on Friday, he sent me a file. Now, not every typeface can be that easily converted. And this isn't done. This is a first pass. But this is 1,400 glyphs. It's 48 files in a single file that at its first pass still came down to around the 200K mark. The #1 web font, I think, of all time, from Mark Simonson, Proxima Nova. Go blow up his inbox. Let him know that we care. Because this is the platform where we can really take this stuff and run with it and speak loudly and speak eloquently and do really magical things. But the type world doesn't know how big a deal this is for us. Adobe and Monotype are sitting back and they're waiting. They're working on a couple little things. And not to pick on them unduly, but this is important. This is big. This has implications in performance, in accessibility, in user experience, in our design voice, in the future of design on the web. Nothing less. And if we don't tell them that we want it and require it for what we do, then they won't know. They won't make it. They won't figure it out. So let Mark know. Tweet about it. Talk about it. This is the first time you got the premiere. Nobody else knows this is here. But I want everyone to know it's here. Because words have power. And this is how we give them a voice. Thank you very much.